In the summer of 1983, every farmer in Kansas called Hallie Rasmussen crazy. She handed back a brand new $187,000 combine, took a tiny refund, and unlocked a dusty shed. No one believed an old $3,000 tractor could save her farm. But when the dust settled, her silent gamble didn't just shock the county. It changed everything. In June of 1983, inside the St. Francis Case New Holland dealership just off Highway 36 in Cheyenne County, Kansas, a 43-year-old farmer named Halldis Rasmussen stood beside a glass-walled desk, waiting for a signature. Outside on the lot, baking under the early summer sun, sat a brand new 1982 New Holland TR-86 combine. Its twin-rotor technology was the talk of every coffee counter from Bird City to Wheeler, its distinctive yellow paint still smelling fresh from the factory floor. The lease, signed a mere 30 days prior, represented a massive $187,000 obligation. Inside the air-conditioned office, dealership sales manager Bracken Trippenbach Vandermolen held the return paperwork between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were an active hornet. The usual hum of adding machines and cheerful negotiation had died to an uncomfortable stillness. Bracken adjusted his tie with a quick, nervous tug. He had personally fought to get that lease approved for a single woman, farming her late grandfather's section and a half. The Hallstrom family name carried historical weight in the county, and securing that acreage under the New Holland logo had been a major professional victory. Bracken cleared his throat, leaning forward with a look of patronizing concern. He explained that people simply did not return a flagship twin-rotor combine a month into the season. He reminded her of the sheer harvesting capacity she was handing back, warning her that no single operator could manage 300 acres of standing Kansas wheat without modern machinery. Hallie did not argue. She stood quietly, her hands resting calmly on her worn handbag. Her knuckles were broad and her nails trimmed short, carrying the faint, permanent grease lines of someone who knew her way around a machine shop. When Bracken paused, expecting her to soften or admit defeat, she simply pointed to line 42 of the contract, the 30-day unconditional return clause. Defeated by her unyielding silence, Bracken scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page, the pen scratching harshly against the paper. He accepted the keys, convinced he was watching a woman make a catastrophic financial error. As Hallie gathered her copy of the paperwork and walked out toward her dusty Ford pickup, Bracken shook his head. In his mind, she had just surrendered her only chance at surviving the harvest. By the time Hallie's dusty Ford pickup crossed the county line, news of the returned combine had already spread like wildfire through Cheyenne County. In a tight-knit agricultural community, where everyone knew the age of their neighbor's machinery and the size of their land debt, Hallie's decision was met not with silence, but with loud, unified disbelief. Back at the dealership, Bracken Trippenbach Vandermolen stood in the high-ceilinged service bay, leaning against a workbench with a cold soda in hand. Surrounding him were 3 mechanics in blue coveralls, wiping grease from their hands as Bracken delivered his verdict. He gestured out toward the empty lot where the yellow TR-86 sat parked once more. He laughed, a short, barking sound, telling the crew that Hallie had just traded in a modern spaceship for an antique plow horse. He predicted to the whole bay that her old equipment wouldn't survive the first 50 acres of summer wheat, and that she would be back on her knees before the month was out, begging for a smaller lease. 10 miles down Highway 36, at the long wooden table in the back of the Bird City General Store, the laughter took on a heavier, more personal tone. Her uncle Ellard Hallstrom sat over a steaming mug of black coffee, surrounded by half a dozen local growers. Ellard farmed the section directly adjoining Hallie's, running a spotless fleet of modern equipment that was financed to the hilt. He shook his head, stirring his coffee with a loud, rhythmic clink. He told the table that Hallie was dragging the family name backward 30 years out of pure, stubborn nostalgia. He warned that you couldn't pay off a high-interest land loan with sentimental memories, and that her foolish pride would cost her the very soil her grandfather had bled for. Even at the church basement pancake breakfast in Wheeler, the judgment was relentless. Ottilie Boatwright, the local switchboard operator and unofficial social referee of the township, poured maple syrup while offering her sharp assessment. She declared to the gathered women that a single woman farming alone couldn't afford to make such foolish waves. She argued that turning down modern progress was an insult to the community's standard, an unwise misstep that proved Hallie was unfit to manage such a large operation on her own. The verdict across the county was absolute. Hallie Rasmussen had made a fatal mistake, and her fall would be swift. Hallie knew the whispers were trailing her like the trail of dust behind her truck, but as she turned off the county road and pulled into her gravel driveway, the noise of the world faded into silence. She didn't check her mailbox, nor did she glance over toward her Uncle Ellard's manicured fields. Instead, she walked straight to the north side of the homestead, toward the long pole barn that had stood sentinel over the property for nearly half a century. The heavy oak sliding doors were secured by an iron padlock, its surface pitted with rust. Hallie pulled a brass key from her pocket, inserted it into the keyhole, and turned it until the lock gave a heavy, satisfying click. She heaved the door aside, sliding it along its squeaking overhead track. The cool, quiet air inside hit her immediately, rich with the nostalgic scent of stale diesel, aged gear oil, cured oak, and metal dust. In the dim light streaming through the dusty high windows, sitting in the far corner beneath a thick canvas dropcloth, was a shape that had remained undisturbed for years. Hallie walked over, took a handful of the heavy fabric, and pulled it back in one smooth motion. The dust flew up in golden motes, revealing the rounded green and gray tinwork of a 1957 Massey Ferguson 35 tractor. Its red-painted engine block was dulled by time, its tires flat against the packed dirt floor, but its steel frame remained entirely unbroken. Looking at the machine, Hallie was instantly transported back to her youth, watching her grandfather, Ulysses Hallstrom. Ulysses had been more than just a local farmer. He was a master field mechanic whose reputation stretched across 3 counties. He was a man who never looked at a tractor as a mere sum of iron and bolts, but as a living, breathing, mechanical organism. He possessed an almost supernatural ear for engine timing, able to diagnose a single burned exhaust valve or a failing hydraulic pump simply by resting his palm on the hood while the engine idled. He had taught Hallie that modern shiny paint was just an optical illusion designed to hide debt, whereas a simple, well-engineered engine was an instrument of absolute independence. Standing in the quiet light of the shed, resting her hand on the cold hood of the Massey Ferguson 35, Hallie knew that her grandfather's wisdom was about to be put to the ultimate test. Her real education hadn't come from a classroom or a textbook, but from 7 long years spent as her grandfather's shadow. While other girls her age were learning domestic routines, Hallie was standing beside Ulysses on grease-stained concrete, holding a work light until her arms throbbed. Ulysses had treated her not as a girl playing in a workshop, but as an apprentice to a demanding craft. Under his stern but patient guidance, she had learned the language of precision metalwork. She learned how to read a micrometer by touch, feeling for fractions of a thousandth of an inch when measuring a crankshaft journal. She learned to set valve lash on a cold overhead valve engine using a thin strip of feeler gauge, adjusting the rocker arms until the drag felt just right. She spent hours leaning over the workbench, carefully dismantling small carburetors, cleaning out tiny brass jets with fine wire, and resetting float heights so the air-fuel mixture would burn lean and clean. Most importantly, Ulysses made sure she mastered the famous Ferguson 3-point hitch hydraulic system, the groundbreaking mechanical design that had revolutionized lightweight tractor power. He taught her how the internal control spring responded to draft resistance, how to overhaul the internal hydraulic pump, and how to adjust the delicate control quadrant linkage until the draft system would raise and lower a heavy implement with absolute smoothness. To Ulysses, the Ferguson hydraulic system wasn't just iron and fluid. It was a masterpiece of mechanical efficiency that used physics instead of raw, heavy horsepower to accomplish work. Whenever a slick salesman from the city drove past in an air-conditioned car, offering shiny new equipment on easy credit, Ulysses would wipe his hands on a red shop rag and offer the core philosophy that would forever guide her life. He would tell her that simple, fixable machinery pays the bills every single time. He warned her that the banker loves a brand new tractor because the bank owns the title and collects the interest, but he loved an old machine because every bolt, gear, and piston belonged entirely to him. As Hallie looked down at her broad, oil-stained hands inside the quiet shed, those words echoed in her mind like a solemn vow. She owned this steel, and she possessed the knowledge to make it work. Late that evening, as a quiet breeze swept across the Kansas plain, Hallie sat at her worn oak kitchen table under the pale light of a single bulb. Spread out before her were two entirely different financial realities, represented by two stacks of paper. On her left sat the thick, crisp folders from the bank and the Case New Holland dealership, filled with complex amortization schedules, double-digit interest calculations, and mandatory insurance premiums. On her right lay a leather-bound journal with yellowed, dog-eared pages, her grandfather Ulysses's personal service ledger for the 1957 Massey Ferguson 35. Hallie pulled out a yellow legal pad and a sharpened pencil, beginning the cold, precise calculations that the men at the dealership had never bothered to perform. She analyzed the bank's paperwork for the new Holland TR-86. When factoring in the monthly lease payments, high-grade diesel consumption, dealer service charges, and rapid depreciation, the modern combine cost nearly $100 for every single hour it operated in the field. To cover that staggering overhead, a farmer was forced to harvest continuously at maximum speed, taking on massive risk and planting every available square foot just to service the interest on the machine. Then, she turned to Ulysses's ledger. In neat, precise handwriting, her grandfather had recorded decades of operating costs, fuel consumption rates, and routine maintenance entries for the Massey Ferguson. She calculated the cost of running the small four-cylinder gasoline engine, using bulk farm fuel purchased without road tax, alongside low-cost replacement parts she could install herself. The math was undeniably clear. Operating her restored Massey Ferguson 35, paired with a modified pull-behind harvesting implement, would cost less than $15 an hour. The realization settled over her like a profound truth. The modern agricultural system was built on a dangerous illusion, a treadmill where farmers chased massive gross revenues while bleeding away their actual profits to machinery lenders and equipment dealers. Victory in dryland farming didn't belong to the person with the biggest, shiniest machine or the highest daily acreage output. It belonged to the one who kept their overhead near zero. Hallie closed the bank's folder, pushed it aside, and pulled her grandfather's ledger to the center of the table. She had made her choice, grounded entirely in hard numbers. By November of 1983, a bitter winter settled over Cheyenne County, burying the prairie under heavy snow and dropping temperatures well below freezing. While her neighbors gathered around the warm stove at the local elevator to worry about rising interest rates, Hallie lived inside the unheated wooden shed, bundled in an old wool coat and canvas coveralls. Her world shrank to the yellow glow of a hanging work lamp and the cold, unyielding iron of the 1957 Massey Ferguson 35. She began the long, methodical teardown of the tractor's engine. Using a wire brush and a putty knife, she spent the first week scraping away decades of cake dirt, dry grease, and dead chaff that clung to the engine block. Her hands, stiffened by the biting frost, moved with deliberate care. Each bolt she loosened gave a loud, metallic crack that echoed off the high rafters of the shed. She disconnected the rusted exhaust manifold, unbolted the starter motor, and drained the old engine oil, now thick, black, and smelling of ancient combustion. By mid-December, she was ready to pull the heart of the machine. She rigged a heavy-duty chain hoist to a solid oak overhead beam that Ulysses had reinforced decades earlier. Wrapping thick steel chains securely around the four-cylinder standard Vanguard gasoline engine block, she took up the slack. The links clanked harshly in the freezing air as she pulled the hand chain. With a slow, groaning tension, the heavy cast-iron block separated from the transmission housing, hovering suspended in the dim light like a sleeping titan. Moving the block onto her workbench, she removed the cylinder head to inspect the internals. Cleaning out the thick carbon deposits from the piston tops, she peered into the cylinder bores with a flashlight. There, on the inner wall of cylinder number 3, she spotted a series of light vertical scores etched into the steel. Hallie immediately turned to her grandfather's ledger, flipping back to an entry dated August 1974. In Ulysses' precise handwriting, she read the exact diagnosis. Cylinder 3 showing light scoring from dirt intrusion through broken air cleaner hose. Engine still holds pressure, but bore will require honing before next major overhaul. Smiling softly into the cold air, she touched the scored metal. Ulysses had foreseen this exact moment, leaving her the blueprint she needed to bring the tractor back to life. As the deep freeze of winter began to thaw into early spring, Hallie loaded the heavy engine block into the bed of her Ford pickup, wrapping it in thick wool blankets to protect it from moisture. She drove 2 hours east to a small, dusty machine shop on the outskirts of Hayes, run by an elderly machinist named Arthur, who had worked alongside her grandfather 30 years prior. Arthur didn't ask questions about modern combines or county gossip. He simply measured the bores with a dial indicator, nodded approvingly at Ulysses' handwritten notes, and went to work. For $200 cash, he precision-bored the 4 cylinders 0.010 of an inch over, leaving the inner walls smooth and mirror-bright. Returning to her shed with a refreshed block, Hallie began the meticulous process of reassembly. Funded by the $3,000 refund check from her returned New Holland lease, she had sourced high-grade replacement parts, genuine OEM specification oversized pistons, fresh wrist pins, copperhead gaskets, and heavy-duty main bearings. She worked in absolute silence, her mind entirely focused on the mechanical feedback of her tools. Using a long-handled torque wrench, she tightened the main bearing caps and cylinder head bolts in a strict star pattern, waiting for the distinct, sharp click of the tool confirming every bolt was set to exact factory specifications. With the engine assembly coming together, she turned her attention to the tractor's nervous system, the Ferguson hydraulic pump and 3-point hitch linkages. Sitting on an inverted wooden crate, she dismantled the internal hydraulic housing beneath the tractor seat. She flushed out the old milky fluid, replaced the worn control valve plungers, and installed new seals throughout the pump assembly. She carefully adjusted the internal draft control linkages until every pivot arm moved with fluid, friction-free grace. By late April, the rebuilt engine was hoisted back onto the chassis and bolted firmly to the transmission case. She rewired the electrical system with heavy-gauge copper strand, installed a freshly rebuilt starter, and plumbed new fuel lines from the tank down to the clean brass carburetor. The Massey Ferguson 35 was no longer a rusting relic sitting forgotten under a canvas cloth. It was a fully renewed instrument of precision engineering, built with her own hands and waiting for its moment of truth. On a crisp morning in the first week of May, sunlight poured through the open double doors of the shed, illuminating the fully reassembled Massey Ferguson 35. The fresh tin work gleamed soft gray and red in the early light, the faint smell of fresh paint and clean grease rising in the warming spring air. The time for preparation had passed. Hallie stepped up onto the footrest and swung her leg over the tractor, taking her place on the worn steel seat, the broad pan seat smooth from 30 years of her grandfather's wear. Her boot rested firmly on the clutch pedal. She reached down with a gloved hand and turned the brass petcock valve below the tank, watching clear gasoline fill the glass sediment bowl. She pulled the choke lever out halfway, set the hand throttle to a quarter open, and gripped the key. Taking a slow, steady breath, she pressed the starter button. The heavy 6-volt starter motor groaned against the flywheel, turning the engine over with a slow, rhythmic thump-thump-thump. A light cough spat from the vertical exhaust pipe, followed by a puff of gray smoke. Then, with a sudden, surging roar that rattled the corrugated metal roof overhead, all 4 cylinders caught fire. The engine shook briefly in its mounts before settling into a deep, muscular idle. Hallie didn't cheer. She moved instantly into diagnostic mode. She slid off the seat, leaning her ear close to the cylinder head with a long wooden handle pressed to her temple like a stethoscope. She adjusted the distributor housing by a fraction of a degree, advancing the ignition timing until the idle smoothed into a crisp, steady drumbeat without a hint of a misfire. Stepping back around to the instrument panel, her eyes locked onto the mechanical gauges. The oil pressure needle swept upward, locking in at a firm, healthy 45 pounds per square inch. She reached for the hydraulic quadrant lever beside her hip and pulled it upward. Behind the tractor, the heavy steel lower lift arms rose smoothly, holding firm without a tremor or a drop in engine speed. The heart of the machine was beating again, strong, precise, and entirely under her control. The summer wheat of 1984 ripened under a fierce, unrelenting Kansas sun, turning the rolling fields into a sea of golden grain. As harvest began across Cheyenne County, Hallie drove the restored Massey Ferguson 35 out of her driveway. Pulling a vintage 12-foot Draper header she had salvaged from a neighbor's boneyard and re-engineered to run off the tractor's power takeoff. To the casual observer, it was an absurd sight, a tiny gray and red tractor pulling a rusty, low-slung harvesting implement through 300 acres of heavy wheat. The initial days were a grueling trial of patience and mechanical debugging. On the second afternoon, right in the middle of a long pass, a worn hydraulic hose feeding the header lift suddenly ruptured under pressure, spraying a mist of warm fluid across the engine cowl. Hallie calmly disengaged the PTO, shut off the ignition, and stepped down into the stubble. She didn't panic or reach for a phone to call an expensive mobile dealer technician. Walking back to her toolbox in the truck, she fetched a spare length of high-pressure hose and 2 brass fittings. Working under the hot sun, she spliced in the new section, refilled the fluid, and had the implement lifting smoothly again in less than 45 minutes at a total cost of $5. Later that week, her Uncle Ellard pulled up along the fence line separating their properties in his gleaming, high-capacity combine. From his air-conditioned cab high above the dust, he watched Hallie working at a steady walking pace of 3 miles an hour, taking small 12-foot cuts, while the hot prairie wind blew dust across her wide-brimmed straw hat. Ellard shook his head in pity, pulled his throttle back, and roared away, devouring a 30-foot swath at twice her speed. He saw a woman stubbornly drowning in manual labor. He couldn't see the zero-balance ledger sitting on her kitchen table. Day after day, the small red tractor chugged methodically through the heat, its 4-cylinder Vanguard engine humming with unyielding consistency. By the time the last bushel was hauled to the bin in late August, weeks after her neighbors had finished, Hallie was exhausted. But her numbers were pristine. She had brought in her entire crop with under $90 in maintenance expenses. The shakedown was complete, and the old Massey Ferguson had proven it could hold the line. The winter of 1984 became a season of quiet refinement. Hallie no longer needed to perform major surgery on the Massey Ferguson. Instead, she approached the tractor with the delicate precision of a master watchmaker tuning a fine timepiece. Inside the warmth of her workshop, guided by the handwritten marginal notes in Ulysses's ledger, she set out to optimize every single mechanical system for absolute efficiency. She dismantled the brass carburetor once more, carefully rejetting the main fuel nozzle to lean out the air-fuel mixture, just enough to maximize fuel economy without running the engine hot under load. She advanced the ignition timing by 2 precise degrees, matching the spark gap to the exact combustion profile of high-octane gasoline. Turning her attention to the rear of the machine, she overhauled the Ferguson 3-point hitch linkages once again, polishing the internal hydraulic control valve plungers until they responded to the lightest touch of the quadrant lever. To eliminate the physical strain of manual harvesting, she replaced the old mechanical lift linkage on the Draper header with a custom hydraulic cylinder hooked directly into the tractor's internal pump, giving her effortless, millimetric height control right from the driver's seat. When the sun broke over the Golden Plains for the harvest of 1985, the transformation was undeniable. The Massey Ferguson 35 did not merely run. It performed like an extension of Hallie's own body. The 4-cylinder engine purred with a smooth, resonant hum, burning cleaner and using significantly less fuel than the year before. The hydraulic system responded instantaneously to every rise and dip in the Kansas terrain, protecting the header knives from hitting stones or digging into the topsoil. Day after day, Hallie maintained a relentless, clockwork rhythm. She started before dawn, the single front headlight cutting a bright beam through the morning mist, and worked steadily through the afternoon heat. Without a single mechanical breakdown or forced delay, she consistently harvested 30 acres a day, while her neighbors watched their mailboxes with mounting dread, waiting for the heavy monthly lease statements and high-interest equipment loan notices that threatened their livelihoods. Hallie rode through her fields in absolute peace. Every bushel of wheat brought into her storage bins represented pure, unencumbered profit, earned by a machine that answered to no bank, carried no debt, and ran entirely on her own hard-earned self-reliance. By the summer of 1985, the long-brewing storm of the 1980s American farm credit crisis made landfall in Cheyenne County with devastating force. What had begun as subtle financial pressure transformed into a full-scale economic disaster across the High Plains. Interest rates skyrocketed into double digits, reaching staggering heights that tore through adjustable-rate operating loans. At the same time, global market volatility caused bulk diesel prices to surge, making the simple act of filling the massive fuel tanks of modern machinery a crushing financial burden. Across the county, regional agricultural banks began panicking, issuing demand letters and calling in long-term equipment loans. The very symbols of agricultural prestige, the giant four-wheel drive tractors, the wide-cut articulated combines, and the high-capacity drapers, overnight turned from badges of success into lead anchors dragging farm families toward bankruptcy. Farmers who had leveraged their land to acquire the newest, fastest machinery found themselves trapped in a mathematical nightmare. The high daily output of their modern equipment couldn't outrun the staggering cost of its ownership. In the middle of this financial reckoning, Halldis Rasmussen's operation stood like an unshakable lighthouse in a rising sea. As local growers gathered at county crossroads in hushed, anxious huddles to discuss foreclosures and forced auctions, Halldis drove her small Massey Ferguson 35 out into the golden fields each morning. Her four-cylinder gasoline engine burned modest amounts of inexpensive farm fuel. She owed no monthly lease installments to Bracken Trippenbach Vandermolen at the Case New Holland dealership, carried no principal balances at the First National Bank, and paid zero interest on her equipment. Neighbors who had openly laughed at her 2 summers prior now slowed their pickups along the fence lines, watching her work in silent shock. They saw a woman moving methodically across her land with a small, quiet tractor, harvesting her grain with zero debt hanging over her head. The arrogant consensus that had judged her an eccentric fool dissolved into sober realization. Halldis had not retreated into the past out of stubbornness. She had built an unassailable financial fortress that insulated her from the predatory economic system destroying everyone around her. The final moment of reckoning arrived on a boiling afternoon in early August at the St. Francis Grain Elevator, the economic heart and social tribunal of Cheyenne County. Under the towering concrete silos, where the air hummed with the roar of grain augers and hung heavy with fine chaff, local farmers stood in tight, somber clusters. The mood was stiflingly grim. Men spoke in hushed tones about bank foreclosures, rising fuel surcharges, and land auctions scheduled for the fall. Among them stood her uncle, Ellard Hallstrom, his face pale and etched with severe anxiety. His brand-new combine, the pride of his fleet, was sitting dead in his North 40, immobilized by a massive hydraulic pump failure mid-harvest. The emergency field service call from the dealership, paired with specialized replacement parts shipped from Kansas City, carried a crushing $6,000 price tag, a sudden, unpayable debt that devoured what little profit margin he had left for the year. The heavy iron grate shook as a dusty grain truck pulled onto the scale, its tires grinding against the gravel. The driver's door opened and Halldis stepped out, wearing her familiar work boots and grease-stained leather gloves. She walked over to the scale house window to hand her weight ticket to the manager, her expression calm and composed. Behind her truck came 2 more heavily loaded farm trailers, their wooden sideboards bowing under the weight of thousands of bushels of clean, high-test Kansas wheat. Every single grain had been cut, threshed, and loaded by her small, 30-year-old Massey Ferguson 35. A machine she had completely restored for less than $3,000 using her own hands and her grandfather's mechanical wisdom. As the scale operator called out the test weight, a pristine 61 pounds per bushel, a profound silence fell over the gathered crowd of farmers. Ellard looked at his niece's grain, then down at his own soil-stained hands, unable to say a word. Bracken Trippenbach Vandermolen, who had driven over from the dealership to discuss delinquent accounts with several growers, stood near his sedan, watching the weigh-in with hollow eyes. The verdict was undeniable. The woman they had mocked as a sentimental fool had just delivered a masterclass in agricultural survival, out-harvesting their modern debt traps with $3,000 of pure grit and old-world engineering. By the end of August 1985, when the last load of wheat was swept from her storage bins, the final ledgers were closed across Cheyenne County. Inside the glass-walled office of the First National Bank in St. Francis, 2 loan officers and dealership manager Bracken Trippenbach Vandermolen sat around a mahogany table, staring at a single sheet of paper. It was the complete, verified financial breakdown of Halldis Rasmussen's farming operation over the 1984 and 1985 harvest seasons. The figures were staggering. Across her 640 acres, Hallie had brought in a combined total of $340,000 in gross wheat sales over the 2-year period. But it wasn't the gross revenue that made the banker's pencil drop. It was the expense column, where her neighbors had spent tens of thousands of dollars on monthly equipment lease installments, bank interest, high-tech dealer service fees, and inflated diesel costs. Hallie's total equipment expenditure stood at a mere fraction of a percent. Her initial investment had been $3,000, the exact amount refunded from her canceled New Holland lease, spent entirely on raw engine parts, gaskets, oversized pistons, and fluid lines. Her ongoing operating expenses across 2 full harvests, including bulk low-tax gasoline and minor maintenance items, totaled less than $900. Bracken sat back in his leather chair, the quiet arrogance that had defined him 2 years earlier completely shattered. He had viewed her decision as a suicidal retreat into nostalgia, a foolish insult to modern agricultural progress. Looking at the hard numbers, he realized the brutal truth. Hallie hadn't failed. She had outsmarted every single one of them. While her neighbors were facing bank foreclosures, liquidating livestock, and handing their land titles back to lenders to cover their $187,000 machinery leases, Hallie owned her crop outright. Her strategy wasn't an act of sentimental weakness. It was a brilliant masterclass in financial self-defense. By lowering her overhead to near zero and relying on her own mechanical mastery, she had turned a 30-year-old Massey Ferguson 35 into an unassailable financial shield, securing her land, her freedom, and her grandfather's legacy for decades to come. As the late summer twilight settled over the Kansas prairie, casting long, purple shadows across the golden stubble of her harvested fields, a deep, restorative quiet returned to the land. The deafening roar of the harvest had faded, replaced only by the gentle rustle of the evening prairie wind through the cottonwoods. Hallie walked slowly out to the edge of her north section, where the small gray and red Massey Ferguson 35 stood parked, its 4-cylinder engine cooling down with a soft, periodic pinging of metal. She reached out and rested her broad, grease-stained palm on the tractor's steel hood, feeling the gentle warmth still lingering in the iron beneath her fingers. In that quiet moment, she reflected on the profound truth her grandfather Ulysses had taught her in the dim light of his workshop decades ago. True freedom on the land wasn't measured by the size of a machine's air-conditioned cab or the complexity of its digital computer screens. Real independence lay in self-reliance, in understanding your tools so deeply that no salesman, lender, or economic crisis could ever hold power over your destiny. The modern agricultural world had tried to convince an entire generation of farmers that progress required surrender, that to be successful, one had to exchange self-sufficiency for perpetual debt, trading simple, fixable iron for complex machines designed to keep the operator dependent on dealership mechanics and bank loans. They had called her choice an act of foolish nostalgia, unable to see that mastering simple, reliable tools was the ultimate act of economic self-defense. By trusting her own hands, honoring her grandfather's practical wisdom, and refusing to step onto the treadmill of high-interest debt, she had protected her heritage and secured her sovereignty. Looking out over 640 acres of fertile, debt-free soil, Hallie smiled softly into the cooling evening air. The small tractor beside her was more than just cast iron gears and rubber. It was an unbroken symbol of grit, autonomy, and quiet triumph over modern financial traps. She didn't just farm this soil. She owned it, every single acre, free and clear, protected forever by the mechanical legacy of the simple red machine resting under her hand. Years turned into decades across the high plains, but the steady beat of the Rasmussen farm remained unchanged. While neighboring properties changed hands, divided by bank sales or absorbed into sprawling corporate conglomerates, Hallie's 640 acres stood whole and thriving. season after season. Through golden summers and crisp autumn harvests, the small Massey Ferguson 35 continued to roll out of the old barn, its four-cylinder engine starting with the same smooth, familiar purr. It proved to be far more than just a reliable piece of farm machinery. It was a living bridge connecting past, present, and future, an unbroken thread of self-reliance, mechanical mastery, and fierce independence. Hallie never regretted turning her back on the cycle of modern debt. The lessons taught in her grandfather Ulysses's workshop had not only saved her land during the dark days of the 1980s farm credit crisis, but they had also forged a roadmap for a life lived on her own terms. By choosing practical wisdom over flashy technology and true ownership over endless credit, she preserved her family's legacy and proved that grit, self-sufficiency, and simple, reliable engineering will always outlast the fleeting promises of modern corporate traps. Her story serves as a timeless reminder that true freedom is built with your own two hands and protected by the choices you make when the pressure is highest. Thank you for watching. If Hallie's journey of resilience, self-reliance, and classic iron resonated with you, please hit the like button to help share her story with more viewers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode of deep historical storytelling, mechanical restoration, and timeless rural history. What did you think of Hallie's defiance against the bank during the 1985 credit crisis? Drop your thoughts, memories, or stories of classic farm machinery in the comments below. We read and reply to every single one.